Hi everybody, and welcome to part 4 of medical geography, people and the environment for human geography, as well as conservation. As we continue our topic, one of the things we want to kind of focus on is the mapping, as always, because that's what we do at geographers. We're looking at spatial distributions. And when we're looking at it relative to diseases, one of the things that we want to do is be able to make some predictions. And we can make those predictions about the occurrence of a disease and then put them into a category as being either endemic, meaning that it's always present within a population, not necessarily spreading beyond that population. We can think about it as being epidemic, so is it a contagious or not contagious disease, and does it spread outward from a reservoir, from that source area? And then we can think about being pandemic, so has that epidemic outbreak spread to a global scale? So scale is pretty important here. We also want to be able to recognize the difference between some of these types of occurrences. The graphic here shows us the epidemic versus endemic. And when I stole it off of the internet, I didn't notice that they had misspelled epidemic in the blue box. But setting that aside, you can take a minute, put this on pause if you need to kind of look at what the difference is between something that's an epidemic versus something that's endemic. If we look at examples of endemic, and we're going to look at two, one with people and one not with people. So here's the one with people. This is the continent of Africa. It's telling us 10 diseases that are endemic within the communities, within the population of that particular continent, to the extent that they have data for them. You can see that it ranges from malaria to guinea worm to typhoid fever to measles. Those diseases are always present within those populations, which means that they are endemic, that it never really goes away. It is always there. Some of that has a connection with the environment, some of it does not. So then we're looking for, can we get a shot? And to give us the right type of antibodies so that we are less susceptible to a particular type of disease, something that epidemiologists, of course, are working at. So this is an example of human diseases that are endemic within populations. We also want to think about diseases that are endemic with non-human populations. So this is showing us the Lyme disease human risk map on the left, as well as an article title, Lyme disease ticks endemic in Northeast, Northern Midwest. So if we start with the title of the article, what they're telling us is that if there is a population of ticks that have Lyme disease and it stays within that population, it's always there, it never goes away. And the connection here with people is ticks get on our bodies, they get on our pets, on our dogs, and on our cats, right? And then can that disease then be transmitted to us? Because is it vectored or non-vectored? And these are vector disease. Lyme disease is a vector disease. So the tick carries it, it gets on us, it gets into our bloodstream, we get the disease. Therefore, we get the human risk map. So where do we find those ticks? Can they be eradicated or not? Can we come up with some type of vaccination against Lyme disease or not? So here we're looking at the connection between the human and environment, but not just the human environment connection, but also whether or not that disease is endemic within one of those populations or not. We also want to think about epidemics, right? We want to think about larger outbreaks. It's not endemic, it's an epidemic. So we have it occur within a source area and then it spreads outward from that source area, oftentimes remaining in clusters. Now, the very classic example that we have for an outbreak, for an epidemic, is this map that we've got right here. This is showing us a cholera outbreak in 1854 in London. And what the doctor did as he was treating these cholera patients and trying to figure out what was the cause of the outbreak, he drew a map of the neighborhood and then he put a dot for every household that had a cholera a cholera incident, whether it was one person or the whole family. And by doing that, he was able to identify the water pump at the corner of Broad Street, Lexington, and Poland as being the source of the outbreak. So, what is the source area? And then, how does it diffuse outward from that source area? What is its route? What is its transmission? So, if you lived close to that intersection, that's where you went to get your water. And if the water was contaminated, that meant that's how the outbreak was going to spread. You didn't go all the way to the water pumps on Oxford Street, nor did you go down to Brewer Street unless you lived close by. So this was the very first example that we've got of mapping a disease outbreak in order to identify what is its source area and then how does it transmit from one location to another location or from one person to another person. We can also look at different types of outbreaks. This is for opioid overdoses within the United States. And as you're looking at this particular map, you can see that they've popped out a circle for West Virginia primarily that has a higher incident rate of opioid overdoses. And if you look a little bit more closely at the map, you can see that there are a few regional clusters beyond the one in West Virginia. We can go up to the East Coast, up to Massachusetts. We can go over to New Mexico, and we can see some counties that have higher rates. So this is an example of epidemics. We've got regional clusters. It doesn't have a continuous or an even distribution of the disease. It's scattered around. The same thing happens with this map that's showing us the diffusion of cholera throughout the United States in 1849. What I want you to pay attention to here are the routes, okay? So the routes are shown by the black arrows. And if you look at New York in the top right and you look at New Orleans down in the lower center, you can see that those dates are about 11 days apart. So if you had cholera and you got on a boat in New York and you took that boat down to New Orleans, it might take you about 10 days to get down there. In that 10-day time frame, you've infected people on the boat, right? And then you take another boat and you go upstream, or other people get off the boat and they go up the Mississippi River. So you have a diffusion route up the river. If you got it in New York, you could get on the boat, you might get on a canal, you might take the train, you might go by horse and buggy, but you carry it westward and you carry it southward. You go up the Ohio River from the Mississippi River. If you're a settler and you're taking one of the routes, the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, the Mormon Trail, etc., you take it overland from St. Louis, and you can see how much time it took for that disease to diffuse outward via contaminated water, because somebody's got the disease, they use water, it gets in the water, and somebody else gets it. We see much the same with this slide. This one is showing us a pandemic because look at the scale. We've gone global. We're not just in the United States with clusters of outbreaks along very specific routes, but here we're looking at outbreaks in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in South America, and in North America. We can say what kind of travel routes do we have present. We can also pay attention to when it happened. Was the outbreak in August? Was the outbreak in September, October, November, etc.? It's all about diffusion, traveling through space, and how our mobility and our migratory patterns take that disease with it and transfer it through space. We also want to think about the connection with the environment. So these examples that we've mostly looked at are people, but we know that some of our diseases are connected to environmental conditions. Malaria is always the classic example to go to with that one, although there are others as well. But we also want to be paying attention to what diseases are present in animal populations, and can that disease go from the animal population to the human population and vice versa? Do we have diseases that can negatively impact other species? So this particular graphic that we have here is showing us disease transfer from bats to people. And so generally we refer to something that occurs like this as zoonosis. So it's caused by the parasite, bacteria, etc., that spreads from non-human animals. So Ebola is an example, the Australian Lassa virus, the Hendra, the Nipah out of Southeast Asia, MERS and SARS, and of course now we also can add to our list COVID-19. So we want to be alert to what's happening within an animal population and how diseases within that animal population are being negatively impacted, because that has huge ecological and biological consequences for that ecosystem. We also remember that we are embedded within that natural environment too. So what happens there can have a detrimental impact on us too. And when we're looking at it from the natural ecological environment, right, here is an example of invasive species. Now, it's not necessarily a disease, but an invasive species can bring a disease with it that can decimate native populations of plants and animals. And it can therefore change the biodiversity within that environment. And when the biodiversity changes within that environment, it means that it is less resistant potentially to diseases that make its way there, whether they are long-standing diseases that are very common or whether they are new diseases, whether they are novel diseases. So we want to pay attention to what's happening as invasive species makes their way into environments that they haven't been in before, as you can see with the zebra mussel and the quagga mussel and how it is moved throughout the water systems of the United States. And if you look carefully, you can see that Lake Michigan has a lot of green dots, and the green dots are the quagga mussels. And if you look carefully, you can see there's some quagga mussels on the Mississippi River and on the Ohio River. How long does it take them to reproduce? What kind of impact do they have on our water system infrastructure, on our sewage treatment plants? There's almost always a connection with some of these diseases and our human environment interactions. So this brings us to the end of part 4. When you're ready, continue on to part 5.